It was late September of 2018 when I decided to leave the city for a while and try something different. I was 31 then, not married, working remotely, and tired of everything feeling loud, crowded, and fast. I'd been living in Milwaukee for almost 10 years, and it had started to wear me down. I wasn't looking for some big life change, just space. I wanted silence. I wanted to do something with my hands for once instead of staring at screens. That's how the idea of building a small cabin came into my head. I wasn't aiming for anything big or fancy, just a basic wooden structure somewhere quiet. I had a cousin, Will, who owned some land out in the middle of nowhere in northern Minnesota, about an hour past Grand Rapids. Will wasn't using it for anything besides some off-season hunting, so he said I could stay out there as long as I didn't wreck anything or build too close to the creek. He even let me borrow an old generator and some basic tools. The land was remote. You had to take a gravel road to a dirt path and then hike a little ways in to get to the clearing. It was peaceful, thick woods all around. No neighbors, no cell signal, no lights at night. Just woods, wind, and wildlife. I drove up in my beat-up Dodge truck with a tarp, lumber, nails, and enough food to last me 2 weeks. I brought a small tent, an old hunting knife, a heavy flashlight, and 2 extra gallons of gas for the generator. I had no expectations other than I'd spend my time working with my hands and maybe getting back into some kind of rhythm with the world. Just me and the trees. The first few days were good. The weather was steady, cool but dry, with that kind of early fall wind that smells like wet leaves and dirt. I cleared a small patch with a handsaw and an axe where I wanted the cabin to go. It wasn't anything massive, just a 10 by 10 box with a pitched roof, no insulation, no plumbing, no windows other than the cutout I left above where the door would go. The plan was simple: build a frame, put a roof on it, lay a floor, and call it a retreat. I could always come back and improve it over time. I'd wake up at sunrise, make coffee over a little propane burner, and then get to work sawing, hammering, sweating. Felt good. My hands hurt in a way I hadn't felt in years, earned pain. That part made sense. The days passed quietly. Then the rain started. It wasn't a gentle rain. It didn't trickle down through the trees. It came like a sheet, heavy and cold, with winds that bent the smaller trees and soaked everything in minutes. I had checked the weather before leaving, but service was patchy, and I must have missed whatever system was blowing through. That night, it started at around 7 and didn't let up. My tent held for a while, but the seams leaked, and by midnight, the ground was wet beneath me. I was shivering in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl like something alive. By the next morning, everything was soaked. My boots were damp inside, the generator wouldn't start, and the half-built cabin frame looked warped. I tried to work anyway, tried to cover what I could with tarps, tried to dig little trenches to keep water from pooling, but the rain didn't care, kept coming. There was no signal, no updates, just gray skies and mud. I spent most of that day under the biggest tarp I had, trying to keep the tools dry and checking over the cabin frame for damage. I told myself I'd stay 2 more nights and then leave. It wasn't worth it to wait out a week of rain in a wet tent. That evening, I boiled a can of chili, ate it straight out of the pot, and tried to dry my socks over the burner. My hands were swollen from the cold. My back ached. I felt more tired than usual, and I couldn't stop coughing. That's when I started noticing things. First, it was the noise. There's always sound in the woods. Branches cracking, birds, maybe a deer off in the brush. But this wasn't wildlife noise. It was something different. It started as a low thud, not thunder, not trees falling. A steady, irregular sound that I heard around 10 or 11 at night. I was laying there, damp, wide awake, when I noticed it. Thud, thud, pause, thud, like something hitting the ground or being dropped. It didn't sound close, but it didn't sound far either. I figured it was maybe a log rolling or branches breaking from the wind, but it kept going. for almost 20 minutes. Then it stopped. The next morning, I looked around but didn't find anything. No footprints, no fallen branches, nothing odd. But the sound stuck with me. I started thinking maybe it was my own head playing games. Too much stress, too little sleep. But something still felt wrong. That second rainy night was worse. It got colder. The rain was louder. The wind knocked over a stack of lumber I had leaned against a tree. I heard more sounds, this time closer. Soft snapping noises, like someone stepping on wet twigs. Not animal noises, something heavier, slower. I stayed in the tent, holding the flashlight, not breathing for long stretches, waiting to hear it again. And I did, only once. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the mud. I didn't sleep at all. When morning came, I stepped outside and saw it. Something had moved near the edge of the clearing. There were lines in the mud, not tracks, just two parallel trails like something had been dragged. I followed them about 15 feet before they vanished into the brush. There was no sign of an animal.
No fur, no bones.
No blood, but I saw a few strands of wire, rusted and tangled, half buried in the ground where the drag marks started. It looked like something old, something that had been there for years. I couldn't explain it. I told myself again that I'd leave the next morning, even if the weather cleared. I was done. I packed up half my gear into the truck that afternoon and shoved the rest into a plastic bin to keep it dry. I didn't care about finishing the cabin anymore. I just wanted out. The third night was when things really went bad. It started just like the others. Rain hitting the tent, wind in the trees, darkness so thick I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without the flashlight. I was lying in my sleeping bag, thinking about driving out at first light, when I heard footsteps. Clear, deliberate steps on wet ground. Not an animal, not wind, not rain. Human steps. They were slow, careful, just on the edge of my hearing. I shut off my flashlight and sat up, straining to listen. The steps came closer, then stopped. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. Fabric moving, like the sound of a jacket rubbing as someone walked. Then a quiet, wet breathing, just outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I waited for a face to press against the tent wall, for a zipper to open, but nothing happened. After maybe 2 minutes, the sounds moved away, slow, dragging again, just like before. I waited an hour before I turned my flashlight back on. Nothing.
Nos chaps, nos ados.
But I knew someone had been there. When the rain slowed just before dawn, I packed everything into the truck and didn't bother to roll up the tent. I left it there, flapping in the wind, and got in and drove. The dirt road had turned to muck, and I nearly slid into a ditch twice, but I didn't care. I just kept driving until I hit the gravel road, then the highway, and then I didn't stop until I was back in Duluth. I slept in the truck in a gas station parking lot that night. I didn't want to check into a hotel. I didn't want to explain why I looked like I'd crawled out of a swamp. I just sat there in the driver's seat, soaked and shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. A week later, I went back with Will during daylight. We found the tent collapsed and torn. Not cut with a knife, but torn in 2 places like something had snagged it. The frame of the cabin was half fallen, like something had pushed one wall inward. My tools were still there, though a few were rusted beyond use from the rain. But the strangest thing was the ground behind the cabin. There were more drag marks, 2 deep grooves, leading away into the woods. But this time they weren't fresh. They looked old, worn into the mud like they'd been used again and again over the years. At the end of the grooves, we found a hole, covered by a broken piece of plywood, half filled with rainwater and leaves. Inside, just barely visible under the mess, was something that didn't belong. A chain, thick, old, bolted into the dirt with a rusted loop at the end. Neither of us said anything. Will didn't even ask questions. He just looked at it, then at me, then walked back toward the truck. We never went back. A few months later, Will sold the land to a timber company. I didn't ask what they planned to do with it. I didn't care. I never told anyone else what happened out there. Not because I was scared they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't want to remember. I didn't want to think about what might have been dragging itself through the woods those nights. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything out of a fairy tale. It was something real, something human, maybe, or something that used to be. Something that had been out there long before I ever showed up with my nails and lumber and my idea of peace. All I know is this: if you're ever out in the woods, far from anyone, and the rain starts falling harder than it should, pay attention to the sounds outside your tent. Not all silence means you're alone. It had been almost 4 months since Ray passed away when I finally decided to go back to that damn cabin. I was 42, living alone in a 2-bedroom rental just outside of Helena, Montana, working night shifts at a nursing facility, and trying not to think about how quiet my life had become since the divorce, let alone his death. We'd been separated for over 3 years when I got the call from his cousin. Car accident outside of Missoula. Early morning, slick highway, gone on impact. I didn't cry when I found out. Not right away. Not even at the small service his family held. But that week, I started dreaming about that old cabin, the one we bought together in 2012. Just a small A-frame tucked along a gravel road near 14, up in Lincoln County. It wasn't big, just 1 bedroom, a kitchen with linoleum that curled at the corners, and a screened-in porch that faced the trees. I hadn't been there since we split. He kept it in the settlement. I didn't care. I never thought I'd see it again. But the dreams kept coming, and they weren't peaceful. I wasn't dreaming of quiet mornings with coffee or the smell of firewood. In these dreams, I was waking up in the dark, hearing movement outside the walls, footsteps, breathing, things not seen but felt. Every morning after one of those dreams, I'd sit up in a sweat, pulse thudding in my throat, with this weird thought crawling behind my eyes. Go back. So I did. It was the last week of October when I packed up my Jeep and made the drive up north. I told myself it was for closure. One last weekend to see the place, gather a few things I left behind all those years ago, maybe even decide if I wanted to sell it now that it was technically mine again. His name was off everything after probate. It was just sitting there. The roads started getting familiar once I passed Eureka, that winding 2-lane that broke into gravel after the old sawmill, the weather-warped sign for Pine Hollow Creek, the faded gas station with a broken ice machine out front. I stopped and filled up there. The guy behind the counter didn't say anything, just rang me up with tired eyes. By the time I turned onto the gravel road, it was nearly dusk. Trees thickened around me, blotting out the sky. The forest was quiet. Still, I kept the windows up even though the air was cool and clean. I felt like I was being watched. When I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat, nothing looked out of place. The weeds had grown up a little around the porch. The front steps were weathered. A gutter was half detached, swinging loose, but the structure looked sound. My headlights lit it up for a moment, and then I cut the engine. It was dead silent. I sat there for a minute in the Jeep, key still in the ignition. There was no wind,
No birds.
just the cooling tick of the engine and the sharp creak of settling wood from somewhere in the trees. I told myself I was being dramatic. This was just how the woods felt when you'd been living in town for too long. I got out, stretched my legs, and grabbed my duffel bag and a small box of groceries I'd picked up. Simple stuff. Bread, peanut butter, instant coffee. Enough to get through 2 nights. I had no plans to stay longer than that. The door was stiff, but I managed to get it open. The air inside smelled dry and musty. I stood in the doorway for a while, letting my eyes adjust. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The place was exactly how I remembered it. Wood-paneled walls, small kitchenette, the old couch we picked up from a yard sale in Kalispell, and that ugly red and black checkered blanket still thrown over the armrest. It didn't look like he'd done much with the place since we split. A few beer bottles sat on the counter. One was still half full. The sink had dishes in it. I wasn't sure how long they'd been there, but there weren't any bugs. Just dry rings of old coffee in the bottoms of mugs. The bedroom was untouched. Same bed, same comforter. The drawer on the right side of the dresser still stuck when I tried to open it. I didn't unpack much, just changed into sweatpants, made a sandwich, and sat on the couch with a bottle of water. I didn't even bother lighting a fire. I just wrapped myself in the checkered blanket and stared at the wall, wondering if this had really been a good idea. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. That first night wasn't the worst, but it started things. Sometime past midnight, I woke up freezing. The temperature had dropped fast, and I could see my breath. I got up and dug around until I found a few old logs stacked near the fireplace. They were dry enough. I managed to get a fire going using some old newspaper from under the sink. While the fire started to crackle, I went to the bathroom. The mirror was fogged even though the air was ice cold. I wiped it with my sleeve. My reflection looked pale and unfamiliar. I hadn't realized how rough I looked. Dark under my eyes, jaw tight, skin drawn. On my way back to the couch, I passed the window that looked out onto the backyard, the part that sloped down toward the creek. I paused. I could have sworn I saw something move. It was quick, just a shift of black against the tree line. Could have been a deer, or a trick of the firelight bouncing off the glass. But I stood there for a long time, watching, my body tense, waiting for it to happen again. Didn't. I told myself to stop being stupid and went back to the couch. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, everything looked normal. I went outside and walked the perimeter. The trees were quiet. The creek was low and slow. I found a few of Ray's old tools in the shed, half rusted but still familiar. I sat on the back porch with a cup of weak instant coffee and tried to convince myself to relax. The sun was out. The breeze felt good. It didn't last. That afternoon, I decided to go through the old storage chest we kept near the back of the living room. Mostly just junk, extra blankets, old books, a broken lantern. But at the bottom was something I hadn't seen in years. Ray's trail camera. We used to set it up in the woods behind the cabin to see if we could catch wildlife. It had a big plastic casing and used an SD card. I took it out and checked it. The little green light blinked. Still working. Without really thinking about it, I grabbed a fresh set of batteries and walked it down to the tree line. I mounted it on one of the trees that had a clear view of the sloping yard behind the cabin. I didn't expect to catch anything. It just felt like something to do. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again. This time, not from the cold. It was noise. I stayed still, holding my breath, and listened. There was something outside. Slow, crunching footsteps in the leaves. Not constant, just deliberate, like someone pacing. I stayed frozen on the couch, heart racing. Then I heard the steps move around to the side of the cabin. I didn't dare get up. I just laid back and pretended to sleep, even as I heard the faintest tap against one of the windows. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, everything went silent again, and I must have drifted off. In the morning, I went outside and walked the area. I didn't find footprints, but the leaves were disturbed. A wide patch near the side window looked pressed down, like someone had been crouched there. I felt sick. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was an animal. A bear? No, the movement had been too clean. And the tapping, no animal did that. I decided I'd check the trail camera. The SD card had 4 new files on it. I brought them into the cabin and used my laptop to view them. The first two were nothing, just empty trees. The third showed a deer walking past at dusk. The fourth made me stop breathing. It was taken at 3:14 a.m., according to the timestamp. It showed the tree line, and someone was standing just at the edge of the darkness. Not a deer, not a bear, person. They were facing the cabin, hands at their sides, wearing what looked like a dark hoodie and jeans. The hood was up, but their posture was unmistakable. Upright, watching. They weren't doing anything, just standing. I stared at the image for a long time, then slammed the laptop shut. I didn't know what to do. Drive to town? Tell the sheriff? And say what? That I saw someone on a trail cam behind my ex-husband's cabin? I hadn't been hurt. Nothing was stolen. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it wasn't normal. I packed my things in a rush. I didn't care about the dishes or the groceries I brought. I shoved everything into my duffel and locked the door behind me. I left the cabin at 1 p.m. I didn't stop until I reached Kalispell. I stayed in a cheap motel that night, slept with the lights on, kept the TV playing some cooking show I didn't watch. I checked the locks 3 times before crawling under the blanket. The next morning, I had 3 missed calls. Blocked number. Then I noticed something else. There was a new photo in my phone's gallery. One I didn't take. It was blurry, taken from low to the ground. It showed the side of the motel bed I had slept on. My legs halfway uncovered. A sliver of my face. I deleted it immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the phone. I changed motels that afternoon. Left Kalispell. Drove 5 hours straight to Bozeman, where I had an old coworker who let me stay the night. I didn't go back to Helena. I didn't go back to work for a week. I couldn't even speak clearly for the first few days. Eventually, I contacted a local property management firm and asked them to sell the cabin. I never went back, never saw it again. To this day, I don't know who that was in the photo or how they got into my phone. But I never should have gone back to that cabin, and I will never go back into the woods alone again. It was early September 2017 when I finally agreed to spend a few days up north with my neighbor Rick at his cabin. Rick had retired from the police force the year before. He'd been with the department for almost 30 years, and after his wife passed, he started spending more time at his cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, near a small forgotten area called Silver Creek. We lived in a town about 2 hours south of there, and Rick and I had been neighbors for almost 10 years. We weren't best friends, but we got along well. We'd talk across the fence, share tools, mow each other's lawns when needed. Over time, we started doing things together, fishing trips, garage sales, even a short road trip once. I respected the guy. He didn't say much, but I could tell he'd seen a lot. He had a quiet kind of awareness, never jumpy, never loud, always watching. The plan was simple. He'd drive his pickup up to the cabin Friday morning and I'd follow in my car. We'd stay for 5 days, just some fishing, maybe help him chop wood, relax, drink beer, grill. He said there was no cell service up there, no internet, just a radio and a landline that didn't always work. I was fine with that. I was 38 at the time, single, and needed the break. Life was feeling stale, like every day was just a copy of the last. I packed up some warm clothes, food, and a flashlight. Rick had told me his cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but had a propane heater, running water from a nearby well, and a little generator for the fridge and lights. I brought my dog too, a Labrador named Tucker. He was 8, gentle, quiet, and sharp. I didn't go anywhere without him. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the turnoff Rick had described. A narrow dirt road with an old rusted sign that just said, County 14. I followed that for another 20 minutes, bouncing along potholes, past thick trees, and nothing else. No houses, no fences, no other cars. felt like the world had gone silent the deeper I went. Finally, I reached the cabin. It was tucked just off the trail, surrounded by tall pines and spruces. The wood was dark with age, and the roof had moss growing along the north side. Rick's truck was parked beside it. He was outside, stacking firewood along the back wall. He nodded at me when I pulled in, and I waved back. The first day went by peacefully. We grilled brats, drank a couple of beers, and Tucker ran around sniffing everything. Rick showed me the inside of the cabin, small, clean, smelled like cedar. A twin bed in one corner, a cot in the other. A little table between them, a shelf of old books, and a wood stove off to the side. There was an outhouse about 20 yards into the trees.
No neighbors.
No lights on the horizon, just trees, wind, and the sound of birds. That night I slept lightly. The forest sounds were louder than I expected. You could hear everything: owls, branches creaking, the wind shifting through the trees. At one point, Tucker lifted his head and growled low, staring at the wall. But he didn't bark, just watched, then laid back down. I figured he heard a raccoon or something outside. The next morning, we went fishing. There was a lake about a half-mile hike from the cabin, down a narrow trail Rick had made over the years. It wasn't on any maps, he said. Just a quiet little place he'd found when he bought the land in the 90s. We caught a few bass, nothing big. It was peaceful. We didn't talk much. Rick wasn't the kind of guy who filled the silence, and honestly, I liked that. On the way back, Rick paused halfway down the trail. He crouched beside a tree, studying something on the ground. I walked over and saw what he was looking at. A single boot print in the dirt, pointed sideways off the path. Not ours. Too big for me, too new looking to be Rick's. It had rained 2 days before, and the print looked fresh. Deep, clean edges. Rick didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a moment, then kept walking. I followed him. Something about the print stayed with me, though. We hadn't seen another person for miles. There were no cars parked anywhere near, and no reason for anyone to be walking through this part of the woods. That night, after we cleaned the fish and ate, I noticed Rick standing by the window. He had the lights off, just staring outside. He stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes, not moving. Then he finally stepped away, locked the door, and sat down on his cot. He didn't say anything. I didn't ask. I slept worse that night. Tucker was restless too. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard him whining. Not loud, but a quiet, nervous sound. I got up and looked outside. The trees were still. The sky was clear, stars bright. I couldn't see anything, but I had that tight feeling in my chest, like when you know someone's watching you. I didn't say anything. I just laid back down, staring at the ceiling until morning. The third day, Rick told me he wanted to check the property line. He didn't explain why, and I didn't push. We walked the edge of his land, using orange markers on trees to guide us. He checked them one by one, stopping occasionally to look around. At one point, we found another boot print. This one was older, maybe a few days, but definitely not ours. Then we found something else. About 60 yards off the trail, in a little clearing, we found what looked like an old campfire. Not Rick's. It had been used recently. There were 3 logs arranged around it like benches. The fire pit was still black with burned wood. There was a beer can half buried in the dirt, and a torn sleeping bag left in a heap nearby. It was dirty and moldy, like someone had been staying there but left in a hurry. Rick crouched and looked at it for a while. Then he stood up and said we should head back. He didn't say it like a suggestion. I followed him. We didn't go fishing again. That night, Rick didn't turn the lights on. He pulled the shades down and made sure everything was locked up tight. He sat at the table and cleaned an old revolver he kept in a locked box under his cot. I hadn't known he brought it. I didn't say anything. I watched him take it apart, oil it, load it. He put it back under the cot and looked at me once. just a glance. Then he laid down. I barely slept. Tucker growled again that night, but this time he barked too. A low, sharp bark like he was warning something. I got up fast and pulled on my boots. Rick was already at the window holding the revolver. He motioned to stay low and I ducked by the door. We listened. Nothing. Just silence. Too silent. The kind of silence that feels wrong. Then we heard it. Faint footsteps outside, moving slow, crunching on the gravel path near the back. Not animal footsteps. Heavy, careful, human. Rick moved to the back window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. He stayed there for a long minute. Then he turned back and nodded once, quietly. Someone was out there. He handed me a flashlight and motioned to stay inside. I sat on the cot with Tucker beside me, his ears up, body tense. Rick slipped out the back door, quiet as a shadow. I waited in the dark for what felt like an hour, probably just 15 minutes. Then I heard a single shot. It echoed through the trees like a crack of thunder, and then silence again. I jumped up, heart pounding. Tucker barked once, loud. I opened the door, flashlight shaking in my hand, and ran outside. Rick came walking back a minute later, face pale. He didn't say anything, just walked past me, into the cabin, and sat down. I followed, confused and shaking. He put the revolver on the table. I finally asked what he saw. He just looked at me, slow and tired, and said, "Someone's been watching this place for a while." That was all. We left the next morning, packed up everything fast. Rick didn't say much. I didn't ask more. He seemed tired, angry, focused. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. Later, when I asked Rick again weeks later, all he said was that he'd seen signs of someone squatting out there before, years back. Maybe a drifter, maybe something else. He didn't go into detail. I haven't gone back since. Neither has he. Sometimes I still wonder who that person was, what they wanted, why they were out there watching a quiet cabin in the middle of nowhere, night after night. Why they never said anything. Why they left behind just footprints, an old campfire, and that tight, sick feeling in your chest when you know you're not alone. I was 28 when it happened. It was in the fall of 2016, in the mountains outside Missoula, Montana. I had been going through a rough patch in my life. My job wasn't going anywhere. I was tired of the city, tired of noise, tired of pretending I was okay. So I took 2 weeks off and went out to the woods. I didn't plan anything fancy. Just me, my backpack, a small tent, and a plan to camp out near the lakes and clear my head. The first few days were peaceful. I didn't see a single person. The trees stretched for miles, the air was crisp, and the only sounds were birds and wind brushing through leaves. I felt alive again, away from everything. I didn't even bring my phone. I told a friend I'd be in the Bitterroot Mountains and that I'd check in after 2 weeks. I followed old trails and animal paths, camped near creeks, and fished. On the 6th day, I decided to hike a bit deeper into the forest, somewhere I hadn't gone before. I crossed a ridge and ended up in a dense part of the woods. The trail thinned out and eventually disappeared. That's when I saw it. The cabin stood deep in a clearing, like it had been forgotten for years. The roof was slanted and half-rotted, the wood blackened and cracked. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd studied before the trip. There was no driveway, no trail, no fence. Just a cabin, hidden among the trees, in a place where it didn't belong. I stood there for a while, just staring. Something felt off, but I didn't turn away. I told myself it was just curiosity, maybe even excitement. I wanted to explore. I wasn't expecting anything, just an empty structure, maybe something left behind, old furniture, wildlife maybe. I walked up slowly. The porch creaked under my boots. A few planks were broken. The front door was wide open, almost inviting. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old wood rot and something stale like mold. Dust floated in the air. The floor had deep scratches across it, like something had been dragged. There was a broken chair in one corner, a stove rusted shut, and a small table flipped on its side. No footprints, no signs of anyone living there, just dead silence. I walked deeper in. There were 2 rooms, the main room and a small side room probably used as a bedroom. I checked the bedroom. A rusted bed frame stood against the wall with a stained mattress on it. On the floor was an old suitcase, cracked and brittle. Inside were clothes, old ones, a man's shirt, a pair of work pants, thick socks, all of it covered in dust. I didn't touch anything. I just looked, then stood up and walked out. I don't know why I stayed so long in there. I sat on the porch, drinking water from my bottle, looking at the trees. I told myself I'd keep walking soon, but my legs felt heavy. My eyes kept looking back at that open doorway. When I finally got up to leave, the sun was dropping behind the trees. The shadows got longer. I realized I had lost track of time. I had also wandered farther than I thought. The idea of setting up my tent so close to that cabin didn't sit well with me, but I had no choice. I couldn't navigate the woods in the dark, and the terrain around the clearing was too uneven to set up camp anywhere else. I pitched my tent about 50 yards from the cabin. I didn't start a fire. I ate a protein bar, drank more water, and zipped myself in early. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't the usual forest noises that kept me up. It was the silence. I didn't hear a single owl.
No crickets.
Not even the wind. It was like the woods were holding their breath. Around midnight, I heard something. Not footsteps, not talking, not an animal. Just a low, dragging noise. Came from the direction of the cabin. I froze. My heart thumped so loud I was sure something would hear it. It stopped as quickly as it started. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I lay there with my knife in my hand, eyes wide open in the dark, until the morning light came through the thin fabric. When I finally got out, I saw nothing. No tracks. No sign of anything disturbed. The cabin door was still wide open. I should have packed up and left. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe it was pride, maybe I didn't want to admit that a cabin scared me. I made coffee, forced myself to eat, and hiked off to explore the area. That afternoon, I found something strange. About a quarter mile from the cabin, deep in the woods, I saw a fire pit, old and unused. Around it were rusted tin cans, broken bottles, and a pile of bones. Small ones. Animal bones, I told myself. Probably a raccoon or a fox. But the bones were stacked neatly, like someone had arranged them. It didn't feel right. I took a few pictures with my disposable camera. Then I turned around and headed back. By the time I got back to the cabin clearing, the wind had picked up. The sky was dark with clouds. I moved my tent closer to the trees for shelter. Again, I avoided the cabin. But even with my back turned, I felt like it was watching me. That night, I heard it again. The dragging noise. This time, it was closer. I lay still, eyes open. Started, stopped, then started again. Like something heavy was being pulled slowly across the forest floor. It came from the cabin's direction. Then it stopped right outside my tent. I didn't breathe. I held the knife tighter. I could hear something. Not breathing, not moving, but present. Just there. Minutes passed. Then it was gone. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and looked around. Nothing, but I saw drag marks in the dirt. They came from the cabin and stopped a few feet from my tent. Then they turned and went back the same way. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks. I didn't even pack my gear properly. I shoved everything into my bag, folded the tent quickly, and left. But the forest didn't let go of me that easily. Less than an hour into my hike, it started raining hard. The trail turned to mud. My boots slipped. I lost my footing and fell down a steep slope. I hit rocks and slid about 30 feet. When I stopped, I tried to get up. My ankle was shot. Pain exploded up my leg. I yelled out without meaning to. I crawled to the side, dragging my backpack with me. It was getting dark. Couldn't walk. I was miles from the closest ranger station, and the rain wasn't stopping. I had no choice. I crawled my way back up the slope using trees and roots. Every move hurt. Took hours. I followed the drag marks back to the clearing, back to the cabin. It was the only shelter. I limped across the porch. The door was still open. Inside, it was dark. I lit a small camping lantern and sat in the far corner of the main room. I didn't explore. I didn't touch anything. I just sat there, ankle throbbing, heart racing. Hours passed. The rain pounded the roof. The cabin groaned. Then I heard it. From the side room, the same dragging sound. It wasn't outside this time. It was inside. I stared at the doorway to the bedroom. The noise stopped. Then I heard breathing. Shallow, uneven breathing. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then I saw it. Just a shape at first. A figure slowly stepped into the doorway. A man, or something that used to be one. He was thin, sunken, filthy. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring at me like he couldn't believe I was real. He didn't speak. He didn't yell. He just looked at me, then at the lantern. Then he turned around and disappeared into the dark of the bedroom. I sat there all night, frozen. I don't think he slept. I don't think I did either. When morning came, the rain had stopped. I limped out of the cabin without looking back. I didn't care about pain. I walked for hours. I don't remember the hike. Just trees, dirt, and the thought that he might be behind me. I made it to a ranger station late in the day. They helped me, drove me to a clinic, patched up my ankle. I didn't tell them what happened. I just said I fell. Weeks later, after I got home, I looked at the photos from my camera. Most were normal. Trees, rivers, my tent. But one made my stomach drop. It was a shot of the clearing. I had taken it without thinking. But in the window of the cabin, barely visible, was a face. Watching me. I never went back. I never even finished the trip. I quit my job a month later and moved out of the city completely. Sometimes, late at night, I think about him. Whoever he was. A man who chose to live like that, in silence, in the dark, and I wonder how many others walked past that clearing and never saw the cabin. How many walked into it and never walked back out. It was late November 2023, and I had driven up to a hunting cabin near Eerie, Minnesota, right at the edge of the Superior National Forest. I'd been up there a few times before with my uncle when I was younger, but this time I was going alone. I was 32 at the time, and after a tough year at work and breaking things off with my girlfriend a few months earlier, I wanted to clear my head. Hunting always helped me calm down, and being out in the cold with nothing but trees, animals, and silence was something I'd always looked forward to. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was an old one-room place made of dark logs, built probably back in the 60s. No electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a cot, and a propane lantern. It sat deep in the woods, a solid 40-minute drive from the main road down a half-maintained dirt trail. No one else stayed anywhere nearby, which was the whole point. I didn't want to see another human being for at least a few days. I packed light, my .308 Winchester bolt action, some dried food, a few bottles of water, a hatchet, sleeping bag, and a heavy coat. I also brought a camo trail camera I'd bought a few months earlier, just to get a look at anything that might come near the cabin. I planned on staying 3 nights, maybe 4, depending on how the hunting went. When I arrived, It was cold but clear. The air had that sharp bite that only comes in the last days before the snow really starts to stick. I parked my truck behind the cabin, unlocked the old padlock on the door, and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and dust. No one had been there for a long time. A few mouse droppings on the floor, but otherwise it looked the same as I remembered. After unpacking, I set up the trail camera on a tree facing the clearing out front and then checked over my rifle. I walked a few hundred yards into the woods before sunset to check for signs. Tracks, droppings, anything fresh, but it looked quiet. A few rabbit tracks, maybe some older deer prints. No people.
No boat prints.
That was good. I slept fine that first night, the wood stove giving off a low warmth and the wind scratching lightly at the walls. I heard a few animal sounds out there in the dark. Maybe raccoons or a fox, but nothing unusual. The place was still and calm, just like I wanted. But things started to feel off the next day. I woke up early, before sunrise, and headed deeper into the woods. I had scouted a spot on an old deer trail about half a mile out. I sat in my blind for hours, quiet, barely moving.
No deer.
No anything, not even birds. I don't mean that lightly. There was literally nothing. No crows, no squirrels, not even the distant knock of a woodpecker. Just this stillness. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes animals just move differently when the air pressure shifts or a storm's coming. But by early afternoon, I was feeling uneasy. My instincts were telling me something was wrong, and I'd learned over time to trust them. So I made my way back to the cabin. On the trail about 200 yards out, I noticed something that hadn't been there the day before. A small broken branch, not snapped by an animal either. Clean, like it had been cut with a blade. I stopped and looked around. Nothing, just trees. But I could feel something, like I wasn't alone out there. Back at the cabin, I checked the trail cam. There was only one new photo taken overnight. It was time-stamped 2:14 a.m. It showed the front clearing just like I'd set it up to do. Only this time, there was a blurry shape on the far left. I zoomed in. It looked like a person. I stared at the screen, feeling my chest tighten. The figure was just barely in the frame, turned slightly, like it had been walking across the clearing. It was tall, maybe 6 feet or so, and wearing what looked like a heavy coat or parka. The face was too blurry to make out. I looked around the clearing through the window, but of course there was no one now. The air outside was still and dry. I walked out with my rifle, checking the spot where the figure had been. I didn't find prints or anything unusual. The ground was cold but not frozen solid, so if someone had walked through, there should have been something. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up. I kept the rifle beside me, one round in the chamber. Nothing happened, but the silence was heavy. Too heavy. When the wind picked up around 3 a.m., I thought I heard something brushing against the side of the cabin, too slow and steady to be wind alone. I didn't look outside. I didn't want to know. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin.
No hunting.
I felt watched. I checked the trail cam again. This time, there were 2 pictures around the same time, 2:17 a.m. and 2:18 a.m., both blurry again. But the second one showed something clearer. The same figure now turned toward the camera, and it had no flashlight, no headlamp, just standing there in the dark. That made no sense. You don't just walk through pitch-black woods at 2 in the morning without a light, especially not in terrain like that. Fallen branches, rocks, uneven ground. It wasn't just reckless. It was insane. I thought maybe it was a hunter, but this wasn't public land. It was my uncle's private property. No one else should have been out there. I loaded my rifle, locked the door from inside, and started a fire early. I kept the lantern low and tried not to make noise. I skipped dinner. I listened. Just after 1:30 a.m., I heard crunching in the woods. Not fast, not slow. Steady. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, barely breathing. The steps got closer, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. I sat like that for 2 hours, wide-eyed, until morning started breaking. By now, I was done. I didn't care about hunting anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. I packed everything fast and loaded it into the truck. Before leaving, I yanked the SD card out of the trail cam and threw it in the glove box. I didn't want to look at it right then. My hands were shaking. I drove fast down the dirt road. Trees blurred past. When I hit the main road, I felt like I could finally breathe. Back home in Duluth, I checked the trail cam footage on my laptop. The third night, last night, had 3 images taken in sequence. The first showed nothing. The second showed that same figure again, closer this time. The third was taken from much closer to the camera than I ever placed it. The background was no longer the clearing. It was trees, deep woods. Someone had moved the camera. That part made me feel sick. My setup had been strapped tightly to the tree. I checked it myself every day. Whoever or whatever had walked up to the cabin had taken the camera off after I left it for the night. Then they'd moved it. But why? There were no more pictures after that. The battery had been full, so it wasn't dead. I zoomed in on the last shot. The same tall shape, but now it looked like something was in its hand. Maybe a long stick or a tool, I couldn't tell. But the position of its body, it wasn't walking. It was just standing there, waiting. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I told my uncle there was some kind of vandalism and that I didn't feel safe up there. He shrugged it off like it was nothing, but I could tell even he was a little surprised by how shaken I was. I've hunted a dozen times since then, but always in state forests, always with people nearby. Never alone, and never that deep again. I still think about those pictures. The way the figure stood there without light. The way the forest was silent, like everything else had cleared out. And how someone got close enough to move my camera without me ever hearing them. It wasn't a ghost or anything like that. It was something real, person, and that's what makes it worse. Because I think whoever was out there knew I was alone. They knew where the cabin was, and they weren't just walking by. They were waiting for something. Maybe for me to stay one more night. Maybe for me to come outside. Maybe for me to trust that I was alone. But I didn't, and I left. And maybe that's the only reason I'm here writing this now. It was 2016 when I drove out to a cabin in northern Arizona, not far from the border of the Navajo Nation. I had just turned 32 a month before and needed to get away from people for a while. I had been working a desk job in Phoenix for nearly 7 years, and I was tired. Not just physically, but mentally. Everything in my life had started to feel dull. I barely saw my friends anymore. My girlfriend and I had broken up months before, and I was just tired of staring at screens all day. A friend of mine from college had this small, beat-up hunting cabin about 4 hours north, near a place called Kaibab. It wasn't exactly on anyone's radar. He used it in the winter sometimes, but it had no real insulation, no Wi-Fi, no TV, barely any signal, and was a good 20-minute drive from the nearest gas station. I asked him if I could use it for a few days, and he gave me the okay without hesitation. He just warned me it was a little rough and to bring my own water and food. I left early on a Friday morning. I didn't bring much, just a cooler of food, a few gallons of water, a sleeping bag, and a rifle. I had done enough solo camping to know how to keep things basic. The drive up took longer than expected. I hit traffic outside of Flagstaff, and then the last hour was on a narrow, mostly dirt road full of switchbacks and potholes. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. The cabin itself looked worse than I remembered from pictures he had shown me. It was a single-room place, made of weather-beaten wood with a sagging roof and one small window facing the west. There was a narrow porch out front and a couple of rusted metal chairs leaning against the wall. The door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside was even more bare than I expected. A cot on one side, an old wood stove in the corner, a table with a propane lantern on it, and some mouse droppings scattered near the walls. I unpacked quickly and sat outside with a can of beans and a beer, watching the sky go from orange to purple. It was quiet, way too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my own breathing and a few insects clicking in the grass. I went to sleep early that night, even though it took me a while to actually drift off. I was jumpy. Every sound outside made my ears perk up. Twigs snapping, something brushing against the side of the cabin. I told myself it was probably raccoons or maybe deer. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold. The temperature had dropped hard overnight. I made some coffee on the propane stove, stepped outside, and saw prints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't boot prints, at least not fully. They looked like bare feet, but the spacing was off. The toes were spread out wider than normal, and they didn't look right. I bent down to look closer. Whatever made them was barefoot, but the stride was long, almost unnaturally long. I checked around the cabin but didn't see anything else. No trash disturbed, nothing missing. I told myself it had to be some local guy walking around drunk or high, maybe even a kid messing around. The idea of someone creeping around a remote cabin barefoot didn't sit right, but I didn't have a better explanation. Still, I kept the rifle closer to my cot that day. That afternoon I hiked about a mile down the trail behind the cabin. It led to a small creek that was mostly dried up this time of year. I brought my journal and a sandwich and sat on a rock for a few hours, writing. I wanted to clear my head, and the fresh air helped. I didn't see or hear a single person the whole time I was out there. When I got back to the cabin around 4 in the afternoon, I saw something on the porch that hadn't been there before. It was a bone, a long, thin one, maybe from a deer leg, but it had been stripped clean. And it was standing upright against the front door like someone had leaned it there on purpose. I looked around again. Nothing. No tracks.
No noise.
The sun was still out, but I suddenly felt watched. I picked up the bone, tossed it into the trees, and locked the cabin door behind me. That night was worse. Around midnight, I heard scratching. Not on the door, but along the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't loud, more like nails slowly dragging across wood. It stopped and started again every few minutes. I sat up in the cot and didn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't go outside. I just sat there with my rifle in my lap, staring at the wall, heart pounding. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped out. The bone I had thrown into the woods the day before was back. Same spot, same angle, leaning against the door. This time I didn't touch it. I walked around the cabin, heart racing, scanning every tree and bush. I found more tracks, this time farther out, circling the cabin, and not just one set. 2, maybe 3 sets of prints. Same shape, barefoot, wide, weirdly long strides. I went back inside and locked the door. I seriously thought about leaving that morning, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe I thought I could handle a couple of pranksters. But I was wrong. The next night broke me. It was around 1 in the morning when I woke up to something tapping on the window. The small one above the table. Just a light tap, like the tip of a finger. I sat up, grabbed the rifle, and stared at it. The tapping stopped. Then something moved past it, fast. A shadow, thin and tall. I couldn't see details, just motion. Then footsteps on the porch. Slow, measured. 1 step every few seconds. I stood frozen, my hands shaking. I didn't want to shoot through the door unless I had to. I waited. Then the door handle turned. It didn't jiggle or shake violently. It just turned slowly, quietly, like whoever was on the other side wanted to see if I had forgotten to lock it. I yelled, just a short burst, a loud shout, hoping it would scare them off. I didn't say any words, just a noise from deep in my chest. Something primal. The handle stopped turning. Footsteps backed away. I waited another hour before I opened the door. Nothing. No one. But that bone was gone. The next morning, I packed up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw my gear into the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 towns away. I looked like hell. The guy behind the counter asked if I was okay. I just nodded. On the drive back to Phoenix, I kept thinking about the prints, the bone, the tapping, and I realized something. This wasn't a skinwalker. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was people. Maybe they thought they were being funny. Maybe it was some local tradition or dare. Maybe it was a group of squatters or some backwoods types living out there and messing with whoever showed up. But whoever they were watching me. From the first night, they never said a word, never made a full move on me, just tested me, pushed the edges of what they could get away with. And the worst part is, if I hadn't locked that door on the last night, I don't think I'd be here writing this. I didn't tell my friend what happened. I just said the place was too quiet for me, but I never went back. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night, if I had gotten too comfortable, if I'd assumed it was just animals, if I hadn't locked the door. They weren't monsters or ghosts, they were people, and that made it worse, because people don't need magic to be terrifying. My name is Darren Keller. I was 34 when I made the mistake of staying in that farm cabin in western Arkansas. This was in late October of 2016, when the leaves were already orange and the air started to hold a cold bite in it. I lived in Springfield, Missouri at the time, and I worked as a freelance wildlife surveyor. That meant I drove around a lot, walked through a lot of empty land, cataloged animals and environmental data, and spent most nights in motels, the back of my SUV, or sometimes in tents if I was out too far. That week, I had a job out near Jasper, Arkansas. The area is mostly rolling hills, with patches of woods, open pastures, old barns, and broken down grain silos. The whole area felt stuck in the early 90s, and I mean that in both a good and eerie way. No chain stores, barely any cell signal, and long stretches of cracked blacktop that went dead straight for miles. Most of the houses looked tired. Peeling paint, caved-in porches, missing shutters, and nearly all of them had dogs that barked when I slowed down to check my GPS. The job was basic. I had to survey a 200-acre property for signs of wildlife activity. Coyotes, deer, hogs, maybe even a few bobcats. The land was owned by a man named Les Hammond. I only spoke with him briefly over the phone the week before. He said he inherited the property from an uncle who passed a few years back and wanted to know what kind of wildlife traffic the area got before deciding what to do with it. The thing that made this survey a little different was that Les said there was an old hunting cabin on the property that I could use. He didn't seem too enthusiastic about it. He said it hadn't been used in years, but it had a working wood stove, a cot, and running water. I figured it would beat sleeping in the SUV again, so I agreed. I arrived late in the afternoon on a Monday. The drive to the property was a mess. Gravel roads washed out in spots, tree branches scratching the sides of my car, and muddy ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. When I finally found the gate, it was nothing more than 2 crooked metal poles and a rusted chain. I parked outside, unhooked it, and drove in. The cabin was deeper in, about 2 miles from the gate. I followed a dirt track that wound through patches of old pine and overgrown fields. Birds scattered as I drove. I passed an old, collapsed barn and a rusting tractor covered in vines. No animals, no movement, just the wind brushing the tops of the grass. When I finally saw the cabin, I had to stop the car and take a second look. It was smaller than I expected, just 1 story, maybe 20 feet wide at most. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wood siding was bleached gray from years of sun. One window in the front was boarded up, and the other was clouded with dirt. The front steps were uneven, and the door had no handle, just a bolt you had to slide from the inside. I stepped out and stretched my legs, already tired from the drive. It was quiet, too quiet. No insects, no rustling leaves, no bird calls. Just silence and the sound of my own boots crunching gravel. I opened the cabin door, creaked hard, stuck a little, then gave. The air inside was musty, dry, thick with dust and the faint smell of old wood. The only light came through the dirty front window. I stood there for a minute, letting my eyes adjust. It was just one big room. A cot in one corner, sagging in the middle. A wood-burning stove in the opposite corner with a stack of dry logs beside it. A table with 2 chairs, one missing a leg. A metal sink with an old-style hand pump. A single, small shelf with some rusted cans of food, beans, peaches, a can of Spam that had ballooned from age. And in the far corner, a door that led to a small bathroom with a cracked toilet and a rusted mirror.
No lights.
No electricity, but the place was dry, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I dropped my backpack, sat on the cot, and just listened. Still nothing. It felt like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I spent the rest of the day hiking the eastern part of the property, setting up trail cameras near game trails and fence lines. I marked a few deer tracks and found one spot with a lot of fresh hog rooting near a dried-up creek. As the sun dropped, I started heading back. I didn't want to be stuck hiking in the dark, not in a place like that. When I got back to the cabin, the sky was already purple. I lit a small fire in the stove with some newspaper and kindling. Took a while, but eventually it caught. The stove clicked and groaned with the heat, and I sat close, rubbing my hands. The temperature outside had dropped fast, and I was glad I had my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep right away. I never do, especially in new places. I lay there, listening to the sound of the stove, the occasional creak of the wood settling, and the wind scraping across the old siding. I thought I'd drift off eventually, but then I heard something. Footsteps. At least that's what it sounded like. Slow, deliberate steps in the dirt just outside the cabin. They stopped and started, shuffled a bit, then went quiet. My first thought was that it might be a deer or even a coyote, but it didn't sound like that. It was too heavy, too slow. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Then, 2 faint knocks, soft, like knuckles against the wooden wall near the window. I sat up straight. My heart was racing. Then silence again. I waited a long time. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a branch or some animal bumping around. Maybe even the wind slapping something loose on the outside wall. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the window, watching the moonlight crawl across the floor. I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next morning, I woke up early. The inside of the cabin was freezing. My breath came out in little clouds. I made a small fire again, warmed my hands, and went outside. There was frost on the grass, and the air smelled wet. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. I found them, about 6 or 7 feet from the front door. Pressed into the dirt and frost were clear boot prints, fresh, large, and deep. Not mine. They led from the trees to the window and stopped right below it. Then they turned and went back into the trees. I just stood there, staring. Someone had come up to the cabin. They'd stood at the window, knocked, watched. I don't scare easy. I've spent nights in bear country, had snakes under my tent, even had a mountain lion trail me once in Utah. But this was different. This was human, and they'd been close. I packed up my gear and set off on foot, walking the property again. I was tense all day, checking behind me more than I should have, listening to every sound. I found more tracks near the back edge of the property. Deep boot prints, like someone had been pacing along the old fence line. No animal would do that. I moved my trail cams, put one right by the cabin pointing at the window. I had a feeling I wouldn't like what I'd find on it, but I needed to know. That night, I didn't light the stove. I kept the inside dark and cold. I sat in the corner by the shelf, wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring at the door. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slower. They moved around the cabin, crunching softly in the dirt. Once, they paused by the wall behind me. I imagined someone standing just inches away on the other side of the boards. Then I heard a faint metallic sound, like a knife or something metal being dragged along the siding. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was gonna finish up quick, pack my gear, and get the hell out of there. I didn't want to know who was coming around. I didn't want to meet them. I just wanted to leave. I retrieved the trail camera and reviewed the footage on my laptop. There he was. At 2:11 a.m., the camera caught a man walking up to the window. He was tall, heavyset, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His face wasn't clear, turned away from the lens, but he stood there for nearly a full minute, just standing. Then he reached up and knocked on the glass, twice. Then he walked off into the trees.
No flashlight.
No vehicle lights, just him. I packed everything in 30 minutes and drove out. I didn't stop, didn't eat, didn't check my phone until I was back in Jasper. I called Les Hammond to tell him what happened. I didn't go into detail, just said someone was snooping around and I didn't feel safe staying. He seemed surprised, said nobody lived nearby, that the property was surrounded by unused land and old government plots. I told him to check the cabin himself. I deleted the trail cam footage and moved on. But something still bugs me. That second night, when the man was outside again, I never heard a car. No engine.
No headlights.
No dogs barking in the distance. Just footsteps. Which means he might have been there the whole time. Already on the property. Already watching. Maybe even in the woods that first day when I arrived. Maybe he wasn't snooping. Maybe I was. It was the fall of 2014. I was 28 back then, living in Cincinnati, Ohio. I had just gone through a rough breakup, quit a job I hated, and felt like I had nothing going on. My older brother told me I needed a reset. I agreed, but I didn't want to be around people. I needed quiet and I needed space. So I decided to go camping for a few days out in a more remote part of Kentucky, where the woods stretched for miles and you could walk half a day without seeing anyone. I didn't want a campsite or some place with designated trails. I wanted raw wilderness. I used to hike a lot when I was younger, and I still had all my gear. So I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, some canned food, a small stove, and set off in my old Jeep Cherokee. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, something I now realize was a big mistake. My plan was to park off a logging road I had found on an old topographic map, hike in about 5 miles, set up camp by a stream, and spend 3 nights there. No cell service, no noise, just trees and wind and time alone. That was the plan. The first day went just fine. I parked at the end of a narrow dirt track where it dead-ended in a thicket. The trail wasn't marked, but I could make out a path that deer or maybe hunters had used. I followed that with my pack on, stopping every hour or so to sip water and rest. The woods were quiet, just the crunch of my boots and the rustle of small animals in the brush. By late afternoon, I reached a wide stream and decided that would be my base. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire, and boiled some water for one of those freeze-dried meals. That night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, wrapped in my jacket, watching the flames while the stars slowly appeared above the trees. I fell asleep to the sound of water flowing over rocks. The second day, I went exploring. I left my pack at camp and took only a water bottle and my folding knife. I followed the stream east for a few miles, then veered uphill through thicker woods. I didn't see any signs of other people.
No wrapers, no footprints, no shell casings.
It was untouched. Then, around mid-afternoon, as I was heading back, I came across something odd. A trail. Not like the animal ones I'd been following. This was wide. Not fresh, but clearly used before. The way the brush was pushed back, it had seen boots, maybe an ATV. Curious, I followed it for maybe 10 minutes. That's when I saw the cabin. It was about 50 yards off the trail, hidden behind a wall of pine trees. Old but not ruined. The roof sagged slightly but didn't look like it leaked. The wood was gray and dry, but the structure still stood straight. There was a porch with 2 broken chairs and a stack of chopped logs beside the door. No power lines.
No mailbox.
No path for a car to reach it. Just this quiet old thing sitting in the woods like it had been forgotten. I stood there a long time just looking. I don't know why, but something about it made me nervous. It didn't feel right, but I was curious, and curiosity is a stupid thing in places like that. I walked up to it.
No lights, no noise.
I tapped the door lightly with my knuckle. It was unlocked. I pushed it open a few inches and peered in. It was dark and smelled musty. There was a wood stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a small bed, and some shelves with dusty jars. No signs of anyone living there now, no food, no clothes, no photos. Just a dead place. Still, it felt strange, like someone had been there recently. A metal mug sat on the table, clean, not dusty like the shelves. There was chopped wood stacked near the stove, too neat to be from years ago. I backed out and closed the door. I returned to camp before sunset, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. Who owned it? Were they nearby? Why wasn't it locked? It made me uneasy, and I didn't sleep well that night. Every twig snap in the distance made me sit up. The 3rd day, I decided to pack up early and head out. I didn't want to risk running into whoever might use that cabin. I woke up just after sunrise, boiled water for oatmeal, and started breaking down my tent. That's when I noticed it. Footprints. About 30 feet from my tent, half hidden in the grass and dirt, were boot prints. Big ones. Not mine. I walked around to check the area. They came in from the direction of the woods, not from the trail I used. They circled my tent once, then vanished back into the trees. I didn't hear anyone in the night. My fire had been out since 10.
No flashlights. No voices.
Just those silent prints. I finished packing in 15 minutes, checking over my shoulder the whole time. I strapped my pack on and started moving fast. I didn't even stop for water. By midday, I reached the logging road. My Jeep was still there, but something had changed. There were deep tire tracks behind it. Not mine. Someone else had come down that road after I parked there. The dirt showed it clearly. They had turned around just a few feet from my bumper. I got in, locked the doors, and drove without stopping. Once I had cell service, I sent my brother a text saying I was fine and headed home. But I didn't go straight home. I stopped in a small town called Harlan, grabbed food, and booked a cheap motel for the night. I felt shaken, and I didn't want to be alone. The motel had a lock, a front desk, and lights, things the forest didn't. At around 8 p.m. that night, I sat in that dingy room with the TV on low and started going over everything in my head. The footprints, the unlocked cabin, the clean mug, the tire tracks. Felt like someone had been watching me out there. The next day, back in Cincinnati, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent the whole week replaying everything. Then, for some reason, I decided to look up that area again. I pulled up satellite images, zoomed into the woods, tried to find that cabin. Nothing came up. I dug deeper and found some old land registry documents. That part of the woods? It used to be a hunting lease, private property. A family owned it until 1998. After that, it changed hands a few times, then just kind of disappeared from records. No new developments, no logged activity. The cabin wasn't listed. No address. I stopped looking after that. Months passed. Life moved on. I got a new job, started seeing someone new. But sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that cabin and the prints around my tent. About a year later, I got a letter. No return address. No name. Just a plain envelope with a folded piece of paper inside. The handwriting was messy, scratched in black ink. It said, "Don't come back. Some things out here don't want to be found." That's all it said. I reported it to the police. They shrugged. No threat, no name, no crime. Could have been a prank. But I knew it wasn't. I never went camping alone again. Never went back to that state. And whenever I drive through rural areas now and see an old cabin by the side of the woods, I keep driving. Fast. Some places are forgotten for a reason, and some people live out there because they want to be left alone. I believe I saw one of them. I believe he saw me first, and I believe he's still out there. I was 31 when I decided to take a long weekend away from everything. It was October 2019, and I had just finished a particularly brutal month at my job in Leeds, working long hours for a construction equipment supplier. My neck was always sore, and my eyes never stopped stinging from staring at spreadsheets and stock lists. I needed a break, something quiet and disconnected. I didn't want to fly anywhere or be around crowds, so I looked for something rural. After a bit of digging, I found a small wooden cabin listed on a no-frills rental site. The photos showed a moss-covered roof, weathered walls, and a thin chimney poking out one side. It sat alone in a clearing just outside the North York Moors, surrounded by trees that looked ancient and twisted. The ad said the cabin had no Wi-Fi and limited phone signal, but that was exactly what I wanted. I booked it for 4 nights. It was a cheap listing, just £120 for the whole stay, which I figured was either a good deal or a red flag. But I told myself not to be paranoid. People always imagine the worst when they see something cheap. Maybe the place was just old or not that comfortable. I didn't care. I wasn't going there for luxury. I packed some basic food, a flashlight, spare clothes, a thermos, a few books, and my hiking boots. I left on a Friday morning early, while the city was still half asleep. Took me just under 2 hours to get there. The last 20 minutes of the drive were down winding, single-lane roads flanked by overgrown hedges and dark woods. My mobile signal dropped to nothing just past a small stone bridge. I passed a rusty gate with a small wooden sign tied to it that just said Hollow Oak Cabin. I pulled off onto a dirt track that crunched under the wheels and bounced my small hatchback all over the place. I could see the cabin through the thinning trees as I got closer. It was smaller than I expected, just a single floor with a slanted roof. The wooden walls were dark and worn, but it didn't look rotten or unsafe. The front porch sagged slightly under my feet as I walked up to the door. I found the key exactly where the owner said it would be, under a flat stone in a planter box. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I could hear nothing but distant rustling from the trees. No cars, no people, not even birds. Inside, the cabin was cold and smelled like dust and would smoke. There was a small wood-burning stove in the corner, a narrow cot along the left wall, a creaky table with a single chair, and shelves stacked with old paperbacks. The kitchen area was just a sink and a counter with a kettle and a camping stove. The only light came from a small window above the sink and another in the far corner. The floor sloped slightly near the back door, and there were cobwebs in every corner. But it felt solid, felt still. I spent most of that first day unpacking and walking around the area. Behind the cabin, there was a narrow path that led into the trees. I followed it for about an hour, just enjoying the quiet. The path was uneven and scattered with wet leaves. Eventually, I found a small brook and sat beside it. eating a granola bar and watching the way the water ran over the rocks. Felt like the world had turned down its volume. That night, I struggled to sleep. The mattress on the cot was thin, and I could hear creaking noises from the roof and distant cracking from the woods outside. The stove gave off good heat, and I had enough wood to last, but I couldn't relax. It was too quiet. In the city, you don't notice how much sound there is until it's gone. I lay there for hours, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, thinking I might hear something. On the second day, I woke up early and made myself tea. I walked farther out into the woods, trying to get lost a little on purpose. I followed deer trails, climbed over mossy logs, and stopped now and then to just listen. Around midday, it started to drizzle, so I headed back. The mud was thick and clung to my boots. I got back to the cabin soaked and had to hang everything by the stove to dry. Later that afternoon, I saw her for the first time. It was around 4:30, the sky already turning dim. I was chopping kindling beside the porch when I glanced up and saw movement through the trees. First, I thought it was a deer, but then I saw the outline, too upright, too still. About 30 feet into the woods, half hidden behind a tree, was a figure. It was a woman, pale coat, long dark hair. She was just standing there, not moving. I thought maybe she was a hiker or someone out walking. I raised my hand as if to wave, but she didn't react. She didn't move at all. She stood with one hand against the tree, just looking toward the cabin. I felt uncomfortable right away, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I looked away for a second to set the axe down, and when I looked back, she was gone. Not walking away, just gone. I stared at the spot for a long time, trying to see if she was hiding behind the tree or crouching, but I saw nothing. I didn't go check. I told myself maybe I imagined her. Maybe the light was weird. I went inside and stayed in for the rest of the night. The next morning, I woke up to find wet footprints on the porch. Just a few, leading from the steps to the door, and then back toward the edge of the clearing. They were bare feet, no shoes. The prints were small, like a woman's. I bent down and touched one. It was still slightly damp. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. No animals I knew left prints like that. They were clearly human. I didn't see her that day. I stayed close to the cabin, splitting more wood, reading, making hot soup. I kept checking the woods, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing. I went to bed early that night, but I didn't sleep. Sometime in the night, I heard something tapping. It was faint at first, like a stick hitting the window, slow and steady. I sat up and listened. It stopped. I waited for a while, barely breathing, and then I heard it again. 3 soft taps, then silence. I didn't get up. I didn't look. I just stayed frozen in that cot until the sun started coming through the window. When I finally checked outside, there was nothing.
No marks, no footprints.
But I knew I hadn't imagined it. On the last full day, I told myself I would leave early. I packed most of my things and left them by the door. I walked back out to the brook, thinking I'd give myself one last bit of quiet before heading home. It was cloudy, and the woods felt colder. I didn't stay long. On the way back, I cut through a part of the woods I hadn't been in yet. That's when I found it. About 200 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a row of bent trees, there was an old structure. It wasn't a house, not exactly. More like a long-forgotten shed or tiny barn. The roof was caved in on one side, and the door hung open on broken hinges. Inside, the floor was dirt, and there were old crates stacked in one corner. Smelled like rot and rust. I looked around carefully and noticed something scratched into the inside wall. Dozens of small lines, carved over and over in groups of 5, like someone was keeping track of days. There were hundreds of them. I stepped back. The hair on my arms was standing up. Something about the place felt wrong. As I turned to leave, I saw something in the mud just outside the doorway. a long strand of black hair, wet and stuck to the ground. I went straight back to the cabin and locked the door. I didn't go back outside, not even to get more wood. I sat in the chair by the stove and stayed there watching the window. That night, I saw her again. It was around 2 in the morning. Couldn't sleep. I got up and walked to the window. She was standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the dark. I could see the outline of her coat, her long hair hanging down. She was closer this time, no more than 20 feet away. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring. I didn't move. I didn't look away. I stood at the window for what felt like hours. Then she turned and walked slowly back into the trees. I left just after sunrise. I didn't eat, didn't clean up. I threw my things into the car and drove down the dirt track as fast as I could. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way back. I didn't stop until I hit a main road and got signal again. I never reported it. What would I have said? That I saw someone? That they stood and stared and vanished? There was no crime. No proof. Just strange sightings and a lot of fear. A few months later, I looked up Hollow Oak Cabin again. The listing was gone. The site had removed it. I tried finding the owner, but their profile had been deleted. I checked news stories in the area. Nothing came up. No missing people, no crimes reported. But I kept thinking about that shed, those scratches in the wall, that long black hair in the mud. Sometimes late at night, I still see her in my head, standing there, watching, not moving, just waiting for something. And I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door, or if I'd stayed just one more night. It was late September 2018 when I took some time off from work. I was 31 years old back then, living in Spokane, Washington. I worked in a warehouse, moving boxes most days, and I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 2 years. The job paid well enough, but the routine wore me down. So I decided to get away from everything for a bit. No phones, no people, no noise. Just me and my dog, Rusty. Rusty was a 4-year-old black Labrador, strong and calm, always sticking close to me. I'd had him since he was a pup. We'd been through a lot, hikes, long drives, fishing trips. He was better company than most people I knew. I trusted him more than anyone. And when I thought about taking a break, it only made sense that I'd bring him with me. I found a listing online for a small cabin in Montana, about 4 hours away from Kalispell. It was cheap, almost too cheap, but the photos showed a simple wooden cabin deep in the woods, a mile off a gravel road, surrounded by pines. No neighbors, no power lines, no cell service. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed my truck with some basic supplies, canned food, water, a sleeping bag, my old rifle just in case, and enough dog food for a week. I also brought a few tools, including a hatchet, flashlight, a small camp stove, and extra batteries. The idea was to stay for 5 days, maybe more, depending on how it felt. We left Spokane just after sunrise on a Monday. The drive was long and quiet. The roads got narrower the closer we got. Eventually, I turned off the pavement onto gravel. My GPS lost signal not long after, but I had printed directions. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. It was even more isolated than the photos had shown. The trees were thick, and the air felt colder up there. The cabin sat on a slope, its wooden frame weathered and gray, but it looked solid enough. A rusted metal chimney poked out from the roof. There was a small porch with a single rocking chair, a wooden step that creaked under my weight, and a door that stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and dust. There were 2 small rooms. One was a bare living space with a wood-burning stove, a few wooden shelves, and a single small window. The other room was a bedroom, no bigger than a closet, with a mattress on the floor and a single wool blanket. No bathroom, just an outhouse about 50 yards out back, half hidden in the trees. It was primitive, but I liked it. Rusty trotted around the place, sniffing corners and wagging his tail. He seemed relaxed. I set up my sleeping bag in the bedroom and cracked a window to let some air in. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove, and I sat on the floor with a can of chili and a spoon. Rusty lay next to me, his head on my thigh. That first night, I slept hard. There was no noise except the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin's wood. I woke up once around 2 a.m., sweating under the blanket. The fire had died down and the room was pitch black. I listened for any sound outside just in case, but it was completely still. Rusty snored lightly near the foot of the mattress. I let myself drift back to sleep. The next 2 days were uneventful. I hiked a bit during the day, staying within a few miles of the cabin. The forest was beautiful, thick with pine, birch, and aspen. I saw deer once, moving through the trees at a distance. No people, no other cabins, just nature. I gathered some fallen branches for the stove and sat on the porch most evenings, drinking coffee and watching the sky turn orange. Rusty stayed close. Sometimes he'd bark at squirrels or birds, but he never seemed tense. At night, we'd sit in silence in the cabin with the fire going. I'd read an old paperback or just sit there, thinking about nothing. But the fourth night felt off. It started with Rusty. Around midnight, he sat up suddenly, ears perked. I was half asleep in my bag, but his movement woke me. He didn't growl or bark. He just stared at the front door. Then he stood up and padded over to it, sniffing hard at the bottom crack. I sat up slowly, listening. There were no footsteps outside, no wind, just stillness. Rusty turned to look at me and let out a low, soft growl. One I'd only heard a few times before, always when he sensed something off. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and flicked it on. The beam lit up the door and part of the wall. Rusty didn't move. His body was stiff. I opened the door slowly. The cold hit me right away. I pointed the light around. The porch was empty. I stepped outside in my boots and sweatpants, shining the light across the trees. The ground was covered in dry leaves and pine needles. I didn't see anything, but something felt wrong, like I was being watched. Rusty didn't come out with me, which was strange. Usually he followed me no matter what. I looked back. He stood just inside the door, staring into the woods. I scanned the trees again, saw nothing, and went back inside. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Neither did Rusty. The next day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed near the cabin. Rusty kept pacing, sniffing around the outside, looking into the trees. Around noon, I took him out back near the outhouse so he could do his business. That's when I noticed something strange. About 20 feet from the outhouse, under the trees, the ground had been disturbed. The dirt was loose, and there was a shallow pit. At first I thought it was an animal digging, maybe a badger or a raccoon, but it was too neat. The edges were straight, like someone had used a spade. Inside the pit was a metal box. I stared at it for a while, then reached down and pulled it up. It was heavy. Rusty stood beside me, his body tense. I set the box on the ground and brushed off the dirt. It was about the size of a toolbox, old and dented. The latch was rusted but still worked. I opened it. Inside were stacks of old photographs, most black and white, wrapped in plastic. There were also newspaper clippings, a small notebook, and a knife with a worn wooden handle. Everything was damp, smelled like earth and rot. I flipped through the notebook. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Most of it was hard to read, but I caught phrases here and there. Can't bury it deep enough, keeps coming back. I saw him again last night. Dogs won't go near it. The photographs were worse. Faces blurred, some scratched out. A few showed people standing in the woods, looking straight at the camera. One had a man holding something long and sharp. The background looked a lot like the woods behind the cabin. I closed the box, heart pounding. Something about it made my skin crawl. I put the box back where I found it, covered it with dirt, and went back inside the cabin. I didn't want anything to do with it. That night it rained hard. Wind rattled the windows. The fire kept us warm, but Rusty stayed awake, staring at the door again. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside. Not an animal, something heavy. Slow steps on the porch, then silence. Rusty stood, growling, his body low. The steps came again, one after the other. Then a knock, just one. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, holding the rifle across my lap. The knock came again, then silence, then retreating steps. I waited until sunrise to open the door. The porch was empty, but on the step, clear as day, was a single muddy boot print. I packed up that morning. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded everything into the truck, Rusty already inside, tail wagging nervously. I took one last look at the cabin and locked the door, though I knew it didn't matter. As I drove back down the gravel road, I passed a trailhead I hadn't noticed before. A small wooden sign stood half buried in leaves. It read, "Derrick Trail closed since 1996. Back in Spokane, I told no one. I didn't report anything. I never posted a review of the cabin. I tossed the printed directions in the trash." Rusty stayed close to me for weeks after. He didn't bark much anymore. I still think about that box, and those photos, and that knock. I think someone or something had been using that cabin for a long time. Maybe the last person buried the box as a warning. Maybe they never got to leave. I did, but I never went back, and I never will. My name is Colin Weaver. I'm 37 now, but this happened when I was 32. It was October 2019, just outside of a small town called Ridgepine in northern Idaho. I had taken some time off work after a stressful year. I was working as a welder back then, long shifts 6 days a week. I had just finished a big job and had 2 weeks to clear my head. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, somewhere far away from my phone, people, traffic, noise. I remembered this small cabin my uncle owned in the woods, one he used to take me to when I was a teenager. The place was simple.
No plumbing.
Just a generator and a couple of propane heaters. It sat up on a hill that overlooked a small field, and behind that field, maybe 200 yards away, there was an old graveyard. That graveyard used to creep me out when I was younger. It wasn't big. Maybe 30 or 40 headstones, most of them too weathered to read. But it had this look, the kind you don't forget. Iron fence that leaned in some places, trees growing out through broken parts of it, and a crooked sign nailed to a rotting post that just said Mayfield Family. The last time I'd been up there was when I was around 17. That was the last summer my uncle took me before he got sick. I hadn't been back since. I called my cousin Mason. He was the one who got the cabin after Uncle Ray passed. Mason said I could use it for as long as I wanted, just needed to bring my own fuel and supplies. So I loaded my truck with enough food, water, gas for the generator, and everything else I'd need for a week or two. My dog, Kilo, a 6-year-old shepherd mix, jumped in the front seat when he saw me packing. He was coming too, of course. The drive took about 7 hours. The last hour was on a dirt road barely wide enough for one car. The tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind us, and the further we got, the quieter it felt. No cell service, no radio signal. I liked that part. Felt like I was finally pulling away from everything. When I reached the cabin, it looked mostly the same. Some of the wood was grayer than I remembered, and the porch sagged a little more. But it still stood strong, tucked back in the trees like it had been forgotten. I got out, stretched, let Kilo run around and sniff every corner of the place. The air was cold, not freezing, but the kind of chill that settles in your bones if you stand still too long. Fall was definitely here. I unpacked everything, fired up the generator, checked the propane tank outside, then lit the small heater inside the cabin. I wasn't planning on doing much that night, just rest. Eat something hot and get a full night's sleep without alarms or emails. I cooked a can of chili, ate it with crackers, fed Kilo, and sat out on the porch for a while with a flashlight and a blanket. The graveyard was barely visible in the distance, just a dark patch behind the field where the tree line started. I could make out the tip of one headstone that reflected my light back at me, even from that far. I went to bed early. The bed inside was old but usable. I laid out my sleeping bag on top of it and let Kilo curl up on the floor beside me. The cabin creaked a bit when the wind hit it, but that was normal. All old places do that. It was quiet besides that. No cars, no voices, no hum from electronics. Just the occasional gust outside and Kilo's breathing. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up around 7, brewed coffee on the little camping stove I brought, and sat on the porch again with a thermos while the sun came up behind the trees. Kilo chased squirrels. I felt good, really good. The kind of good you don't get in the city. I spent most of that first day hiking around the property. My uncle used to show me old trails out there, and I found a couple of them still visible. Overgrown, sure, but I could still follow them. Around noon, I circled near the graveyard. I didn't go inside, just looked from the edge. The fence was more broken than I remembered. Several stones had tipped over. The trees nearby had grown twisted, their roots curling up out of the ground like they were crawling towards something. I kept walking, not wanting to linger. I didn't like how silent it got near that place. Even the birds didn't make much noise near the graveyard. That night, I built a fire out back and cooked some hot dogs. I had a few beers, let Kilo sit beside me and watched the flames dance until the cold drove me inside. Around 10, I turned in. The next morning, something was different. I noticed it as soon as I stepped outside. Kilo had pissed on the porch. He never does that. I thought maybe he'd gotten sick or something scared him. His hackles were up when he went out into the field. He kept turning his head toward the graveyard and growling low. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Around noon, I took a walk again, keeping my rifle slung over my shoulder just in case. Not that I expected trouble, but I was alone out there. You don't take chances that far from help. When I got back, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. One of the propane tanks I'd left outside the back wall had been moved. It was about 5 feet from where I left it, and the cap was unscrewed. I thought maybe a bear had gotten curious, but there weren't any claw marks. Nothing was knocked over. It had just been shifted and opened, like someone was checking it. I closed it back up and brought it inside the porch. The sun was setting by then. That night, Kilo wouldn't stop pacing. He kept walking back and forth between the front door and the windows. Every little creak made his ears perk up. Around midnight, he growled and barked at the back window. I shined my flashlight out there but didn't see anything. Still, I went out with the rifle and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. It was freezing. I stayed out for 10 minutes before giving up and going back inside. At 3:30 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. Something hit the side of the cabin. Not hard, more like a bump. Just one. Then silence. Kilo was standing now, eyes fixed on the wall. I waited. Then I heard it again. This time from the other side. Just a small, deliberate knock. I didn't go outside. I stayed up the rest of the night with my rifle across my lap. Nothing else happened until dawn. I was tired, but I didn't want to leave. I told myself it was probably just a tree branch in the wind, or an animal. But when I stepped outside that morning, I found footprints in the frost around the cabin. Human footprints, barefoot,
nos chus.
And they weren't mine. They came from the direction of the graveyard. They walked around the cabin twice, then vanished back into the woods behind the field. I didn't know what to do at first. I stood there for a long time, just looking at those prints. I followed them about 10 feet into the trees before they disappeared into dead leaves. I thought about packing up and heading home, but I didn't want to seem crazy. Maybe some hiker got lost. But barefoot? That didn't make sense. I locked the cabin up tighter that day. I kept my rifle closer. I didn't hike anymore. I stayed near the porch, read a bit, and kept checking the woods every few minutes. That night I didn't sleep. I just sat in the chair by the window watching the tree lean. Sometime past midnight, I heard the generator sputter outside. Then it stopped, just went dead. The lights inside flickered out. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The air outside felt even colder than usual. The moonlight lit the field enough to see that the wires on the generator had been yanked out. Not chewed, pulled. I didn't go out there. I closed the door, shoved the couch in front of it, and sat with my back against the wall. The next morning, I packed everything. I didn't care if I still had 4 days left. I loaded up the truck, kept my rifle in the passenger seat. I was done. But before I left, I made one last mistake. I went to the graveyard. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see if there was anything obvious. I walked through the broken fence, stepping over fallen branches and leaves. That place felt heavy. The trees were quiet. The headstones looked even older up close. I walked slowly, flashlight in hand, checking the ground. I found fresh dirt at the far end. A small, shallow hole. Not like a real grave, just a hole maybe 2 feet deep. Inside it were bones. Not animal bones. Human fingers. Just the top 2 joints. Not buried well. Like someone had rushed it. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. Kilo jumped in before I even opened the door fully. I drove as fast as I could down that dirt road. I didn't look in the rear view. When I got back to town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. The tracks, the sounds, the hole with the bones. I gave them the exact location, drew it on a map. They said they'd send someone up. A few days later, they called me. They found the shallow hole. The bones were real, human. No ID, no clothing, just bones. They also found more footprints, barefoot, erratic, circling the cabin over several nights. No signs of a camp nearby.
No discarded gear.
Nothing. They never found anyone. I never went back. Mason sold the cabin the next year. Whoever was living out there, if that's what they were doing, they were watching me, circling, coming closer every night. I wasn't supposed to be there. I think I was interrupting something I didn't understand. That graveyard wasn't just for the Mayfield family anymore. I was 33 in the summer of 2016, and I had been working for the National Park Service for almost 9 years. Most of that time I spent out west, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana mostly, bouncing between stations, sometimes staying for just a season, sometimes longer if the job allowed. That summer, I got assigned to a remote ranger cabin deep in the Gallatin National Forest, just north of West Yellowstone, Montana. The cabin sat about 22 miles from the nearest town and could only be reached by a rugged dirt road that was usually impassable by late October. It wasn't one of the places tourists visited often. The terrain was too harsh, the trails unmarked, and there were no big attractions nearby. No waterfalls, no lakes, just miles of thick forest, hills, and some wide open valleys. The job sounded simple. Maintain the trail markers in that sector, check on a few backcountry campsites once or twice a week, and report any signs of illegal hunting or campfires. A helicopter dropped me off with enough supplies to last 4 weeks. Food, fuel, some basic tools, and emergency communication gear. The plan was for a supervisor to check in after 2 weeks by air and restock me if I needed it. I liked the idea of being that far removed from everything. I liked the quiet, felt like freedom. The cabin was a small, one-room structure built decades ago. Thick logs made up the walls, and the roof was corrugated metal. There was a propane stove, a water pump about 100 feet from the back door, a cot, a desk, a radio that only worked with the generator on, and a simple outhouse about 30 yards into the woods. Behind the cabin, a dirt trail split into 3 directions: north toward an old fire lookout tower, east toward some barely used campsites near a dried-up creek, and south toward the dense forest. The first week passed quietly. I spent most of the days hiking the marked routes, replacing signs, repainting trailblazes, and recording notes. The weather was perfect: cool mornings, dry afternoons. I'd return to the cabin sore and sweaty, cook something simple on the stove, read, then sleep. Nights were dark, pitch black, no stars, no moon, and dead silent except for wind and distant animal noises. I didn't even see another person for the first 10 days.
Nu queres, nu ters, nu campers.
Nothing. That was pretty normal for this part of the forest. But by the 11th day, things started to feel different. It was around noon when I noticed the first strange thing. I was doing a routine loop on the East Trail, heading toward one of the backcountry sites about 5 miles out. About halfway there, I saw something off-trail, about 20 yards into the trees. It was a narrow path, not an official one, almost like an animal trail, but it looked like someone had cut some branches away to clear it more recently. I walked a bit down it, thinking maybe someone had made a shortcut or was setting up a camp illegally. But it didn't go far. About 40 feet in, it just ended. Nothing there, no signs of a tent, no fire pit, no gear. Just a flat patch of disturbed dirt and a small pile of stones stacked in a triangle. No obvious purpose. I made a note of it and hiked the rest of the trail, but the rest of the day felt off. I had this nagging feeling I was being watched, like something was always just behind the tree line. I'd pause and look back, but there was nothing. No noise, no movement. That night I got back to the cabin late, and I sat outside for a bit on the steps, trying to shake the feeling. I looked out into the dark trees and thought I saw something. A faint flicker of movement. It was subtle, just a small shift in the blackness, like someone stepping behind a tree. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe my eyes adjusting weird in the low light. Still, I kept the cabin door locked that night, which I didn't usually do. By the next morning, I had mostly convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I headed north toward the old lookout tower. It was a long, steep hike, almost 7 miles uphill. The tower hadn't been used in years, and it was mostly a relic now, but I liked checking it once a season. When I reached the top, I took a break, ate some jerky, and enjoyed the view. From that height, you could see for miles, rolling hills, dense forest, not a single sign of civilization. As I turned to head back, I noticed something down in the valley below, not far from the trail that led back to the cabin. It was small and dark, partially hidden by trees. First, I thought it was a bear, but it didn't move like an animal. It was upright, standing, just standing there. I kept watching for maybe 10 seconds, but then it was gone. I couldn't be sure if it had ducked down or stepped back into the trees, but the movement was smooth, like a person. I felt my stomach twist. I hadn't seen a soul in over a week, and now, suddenly, someone was out here in the middle of nowhere. On the way down, I stopped frequently, listening. Once or twice, I heard something: quick, soft footsteps. Not heavy like an elk or deer, more careful, more human. But when I stopped to listen, it would stop too, like it knew. I got back to the cabin just before dark. The front door was closed, but something was off. I didn't notice it at first, but after I stepped inside, I realized things had moved, just slightly. My pack wasn't where I'd left it. One of the food crates had been shifted. My flashlight was lying on the floor instead of the table. I stood there for a long time just taking it in. I checked everything. Nothing seemed missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. The next morning, I hiked back to the small trail where I'd seen the stacked stones. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I just wanted to make sure I hadn't imagined it. But when I got there, the stones were gone. The dirt was still disturbed, but now there was something else. A small piece of canvas, like from a backpack, half buried under the pine needles. I dug around a bit and found a torn piece of fabric, a button, and what looked like an old zipper. All of it was dirty, worn down, but it didn't look that old, maybe a year, maybe less. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside the cabin felt louder, closer. Once, around 2 a.m., I heard a faint scraping sound just outside the wall near the back, like someone brushing along it slowly with something metal. I didn't move. I just lay there frozen, holding my breath. The next day, I finally used the radio to call in an early pickup. I didn't go into details, just said I was feeling sick and needed to cut the rotation short. They said they could send someone in 2 days. I just had to last 2 more nights. The first night passed with no incidents, but the final night was different. It started with the sound of branches breaking. Not the normal kind, not animals running through. These were deliberate, crunching footsteps. I killed the lights inside and stood near the window, looking out into the trees. There was a figure, just at the edge of the woods, not moving, watching. I stayed still, barely breathing. After a few minutes, it walked away slowly, back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I walked around the cabin and found fresh footprints. Human. They circled the place. Twice. Later that day, the chopper arrived, and I was flown out. I didn't mention the figure, the cabin break-in, or the weird trail. I didn't want to deal with the questions. I just said I felt off. A few weeks later, back at the district office, I looked into old reports from that sector. I found something. A hiker went missing the previous summer near the same area. A 27-year-old man named Eric Powell. Last seen hiking solo around the North Trail Loop. His camp was found intact, but he never showed up again. No signs of attack, no body. They called it an unresolved disappearance. The button and canvas I found? They matched the brand he was wearing when he went missing. I turned them in. That was all I could do. I still work as a ranger, but I haven't taken a solo post since. There are some parts of the forest that feel empty for a reason, and I think that deep down someone or something is choosing to stay out there. Not an animal, not a ghost, just a person, broken somehow, who doesn't want to be found, and who doesn't want to be disturbed. It was late November 2012 when I packed up my things and drove out to the old cabin at Cotton Ridge, deep in the woods of West Virginia. I had just turned 31, and I was tired, burned out from work, sick of the noise of city life in Richmond, and still raw from a bad breakup a few months earlier. The cabin had belonged to my Uncle Jack, who passed away 2 years before. He'd left it to me in his will. I never got around to visiting it until then. It wasn't a fancy place. It was small, with a rust-colored tin roof and weather-worn cedar walls that looked like they'd soaked in 50 years of rain. The road that led there was mostly dirt and rock, and by the time I reached the property, the bottom of my truck was rattling like a tin can. There was a small clearing around the cabin, maybe 40 yards wide, surrounded on all sides by tall, thick woods. Trees so dense they looked like walls. On the far edge of the clearing, there was an old, crooked shed leaning a few degrees too far to the left, half collapsed. I brought my dog Max with me, a 9-year-old golden retriever who had arthritis in his back legs and the kind of calm, slow movements that came from age. He'd been my best friend for almost a decade, and even though he wasn't as quick anymore, He still had that steady presence that made me feel okay, even out in the middle of nowhere. Inside the cabin, it smelled like dust, with smoke and dry rot. The floors creaked when I walked across them. There were only 2 rooms. A main room that had a small fireplace, a cot, a table and some broken chairs, and a back room that served as a tiny kitchen and pantry.
No plumbing.
No electricity, just a hand pump for water outside and a rusted metal barrel for catching rain. I had no real plan for how long I'd stay. I told my brother I'd be gone a few weeks, maybe a month. I brought plenty of canned food, dry goods, water, and fuel for the small propane heater I brought. I even hauled in an old wood stove from a local farm store and set it up the second day I got there. It took most of the morning to bolt the stovepipe through the ceiling and make it airtight, but once it was done, it worked surprisingly well. I started chopping firewood each day just to stay ahead of the cold. By the 3rd night, snow started falling. Not much at first, just thin little flakes swirling down past the cabin windows. The wind had a bite to it that stung my hands even through gloves. The woods were dead quiet. At night, I'd sit in the cabin with Max lying near the fire, listening to the wind push through the trees. Should have been peaceful, and it was for a while. Around day 6 or 7, little things started to bother me. The first thing I noticed was the smell near the shed. It was faint at first, like old meat or something rotting in the dirt. I figured some animal had died out there, maybe a raccoon or fox. I didn't go look right away. I just stayed closer to the cabin and kept to my routine. Wake up, cook breakfast, chop wood, walk the edge of the clearing with Max, eat, read, sleep. But 2 days later, Max started acting strange. He'd walk out into the clearing in the morning like usual, sniff around, take a piss by the tree stump near the firewood pile. But instead of doing his usual circle and lying down near the fire, he started pacing near the shed. Not barking, not growling, just staring and pacing. His body stiff, ears up, tail straight. It gave me a weird feeling. I walked out there to check, thinking maybe there was a bear den or something in the woods nearby. The shed door was slightly open, just a few inches. I didn't remember it being open before. I walked closer, crunched across the frozen grass, and stopped about 10 feet away. The smell hit harder there. Wet, metallic, and sour, like blood and mold mixed together. I grabbed a stick and nudged the door open wider. Inside was just darkness at first. Then as my eyes adjusted, I saw a mess of broken tools, rusted cans, and some old burlap sacks crumpled in the corner. There was something under the sacks. I didn't want to move them. Something about the whole thing felt off. I backed away and closed the door. I shoved an old fence post across the handles to block it. I told myself I'd deal with it later, maybe once the snow let up. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Max kept whining low in his throat. He wasn't scared, just uneasy. Every now and then, he'd get up and go to the window, stare out at the shed, then come back and lie down. The wind blew hard that night, and I kept hearing faint thumps on the roof. Branches, I told myself. The next morning, I found tracks. Not animal tracks, not deer or rabbit or raccoon.
Bootprints.
Human ones, leading from the edge of the woods on the east side of the clearing, across the snow, stopping just short of the shed. Then they disappeared. No prints going back. No sign of anyone approaching from another direction. Just one set of deep, narrow boot prints going in a straight line to the shed. I looked at Max. He was already standing, alert, staring in the same direction. I walked the edge of the clearing with my axe in one hand, heart beating hard in my chest. I didn't find any other prints, no signs of anyone hiding in the woods, but I knew what I saw. I knew those were real. The rest of the day I stayed inside. I kept the door locked and made sure my shotgun was loaded. It had been sitting in the corner near my cot, mostly for bear protection. I'd never used it before. I put it next to the chair where I was sitting and kept the fire going strong. Max never left my side. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside, faint scraping, like metal on wood. Then it stopped. Then again, a soft clunk. Max sat up, ears twitching. He didn't bark, but he was tense. I picked up the shotgun and sat there in the dark, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I got up and crept to the window. I looked out across the moonlit clearing. Snow covered most of the ground now, glowing pale blue in the moonlight. The shed door was wide open again. The fence post I had wedged against it was lying on the ground a few feet away. I stared out there for a long time. Didn't see anyone. Didn't hear anything else. In the morning, I found more prints. A different set this time, wider boot prints. 2 sets now. One going from the woods to the shed. Another from the shed to the far side of the clearing, where the trees grew tight together. I followed them until they disappeared into the woods. I wanted to leave right then. Something told me to pack up, load Max into the truck, and get the hell out. But I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I'd been run off. But I should have left. The next 2 nights were quiet. Too quiet. No wind. No animal sounds. Just dead silence. Even the birds were gone. Max barely left my side now. He slept curled up by my cot, and every sound outside made him perk up. I didn't sleep much. Then on the 10th night, something happened. I woke up just after midnight to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, slow steps, boards creaking under weight. Max was standing by the door, hair up, teeth bared in a silent snarl. I didn't move. I sat in my cot with the shotgun across my lap, heart racing so hard I could barely breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I waited, then something slid under the door. A small piece of paper, folded. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't pick it up until morning. When I finally opened it, there were only 3 words written in blocky, shaky letters. You saw me. That was it. I packed that day. I threw everything into the truck. My gear, my clothes, the food I could carry. I left half the firewood behind. I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone. As I was loading the last bag into the bed, I looked up toward the woods and saw a man standing between 2 trees, about 30 yards away, not moving, just standing. He was wearing a heavy jacket and dark pants. His face was pale. His hands were bare, even in the cold. He didn't move. Neither did I. I slowly walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and got in. Max jumped up next to me. I started the truck, backed up, and turned around. When I looked back, the man was gone. I didn't stop until I hit Route 60, and even then I kept going for another 30 miles. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property 3 months later. I never told the realtor about what happened. I didn't want to explain. I didn't want anyone asking questions. I still don't know who that man was, or what he wanted, or who the second person was, or if there were more of them. I never found out what was under those burlap sacks in the shed, and I don't want to know. Max died the following summer, back home in Richmond. Peaceful, old, warm. I buried him under the big oak tree in my backyard. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing the creak of footsteps on wood, and I have to remind myself that I'm not there anymore. I still have that piece of paper, folded in the bottom drawer of my desk. I keep it as a reminder. Never go back. Never ignore that feeling in your gut. And if you're alone in the woods and something doesn't feel right, leave. Just leave. I was 39 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was October 2016, and life in Dayton, Ohio had started to feel too noisy, too cluttered. I'd been working at the same warehouse job for almost 15 years, waking up at 4:30 every morning, working 10-hour shifts, and spending the rest of my time trying not to think too hard about how dull it all felt. I didn't have any close family left. My younger brother died in a car accident 5 years earlier. My dad passed from a stroke in 2009, and my mom went 2 years after that. I had some old friends I still talk to once in a while, but nothing deep. So when I saw the listing for a cabin up in the Pine Hills region of southern Ohio, about 4 hours away from where I lived, I didn't think too much before booking it for a whole week. It was advertised as a secluded hunter's cabin, tucked a few miles into the woods, off a back road that itself was already hard to find.
No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no TV.
Just a wood stove, an outhouse, and a cot inside. That's exactly what I wanted. A quiet place to think. Or not think. Maybe chop some wood, drink some whiskey, and sleep till noon. Just be out there, away from it all. I packed up my Ford Ranger with enough supplies for a week. Canned food, water, a couple bottles of whiskey, some paperbacks I'd been meaning to read, an axe, and my old .22 rifle. Not that I planned to hunt. I just brought it out of habit. That rifle used to be my dad's, and even though I never shot much, it made me feel like I was still connected to something. I left early on a Saturday morning. The drive was long but smooth. The last 20 miles were mostly dirt roads winding through the trees. I passed maybe one other car. Eventually, I hit the gravel path that led to the cabin. It was barely a road, just two thin tire ruts in the grass and mud. I had to drive slow and keep both hands tight on the wheel as I bounced along, tree branches slapping against the sides of the truck. I passed a rusted-out fence post, then a weathered wooden sign that just read, "Do not trespass." That was supposed to be for hunters and idiots who wandered too far, according to the listing. The cabin was on private land, owned by some retired guy named Hank who rented it out part-time. I never met him. We only emailed. The cabin finally came into view after another 20 minutes of rough driving. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The clearing was maybe half the size of a football field. The cabin looked old but solid single-story, dark wood siding, moss on the roof, a small porch with 2 steps. It didn't have much around it. An old stump with an axe stuck in it, a rusted-out barbecue grill, a stack of firewood leaning against the wall. The outhouse stood about 30 yards away, down a narrow path into the trees. I parked, got out, stretched my legs, and just listened. The quiet was deep, the kind that made your ears ring. No traffic, no people, not even wind. Just the sound of birds somewhere far off and the slight creak of the trees. Felt like stepping into another world. Inside, the cabin was exactly what I expected. One room, a cot on the right with a wool blanket, a small table and chair, a wood stove in the corner, a shelf with a few dusty pots and pans, a lantern hanging from the ceiling beam. Everything smelled like old wood and ash. I liked it immediately. The first few days were good. I chopped some wood, built small fires, took long naps in the middle of the day. At night, I sat on the porch with my whiskey and watched the trees fade into black. I didn't do much thinking, but that was the point. I let my phone die on purpose. I had no way of charging it anyway, but things changed around the 3rd night. That night, I woke up to a strange noise outside. I had no clock, but I guessed it was close to 2 or 3 a.m. The fire in the stove had burned down, so the cabin was cold and silent. I lay there on the cot, wrapped in the blanket, just listening. At first, it was nothing but the usual sounds of the woods, crickets, wind in the trees. Then I heard a crunch. It was soft, like something stepping on a branch. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a raccoon. There were plenty of animals out there. But then I heard it again, closer, a definite footstep, then another, slow, heavy. I sat up and looked toward the door. There was a small window next to it, but I couldn't see anything. Just black. I stood, grabbed the lantern, and turned it on. Its soft orange glow lit up the cabin but didn't reach far through the window. I didn't go outside. I just stood there for a long time, listening. The sound stopped after a while. No more steps. I eventually went back to bed, telling myself it was probably a buck walking through the clearing. The next morning, I walked around the clearing and checked for tracks. The ground was soft from rain the night before. I saw some deer prints near the edge of the woods, but I also saw something else. A boot print, just one, near the back of the cabin, deep in the mud with a worn sole. It was pointed toward the cabin, not away. I stared at it for a long time. My stomach felt tight. I didn't hear any cars or engines the whole time I'd been there. Who would be out here on foot in the middle of the night? I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I kept the axe nearby. I even brought the rifle inside. I didn't load it, but I wanted it there, just in case. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat on the cot in my clothes with the lantern on and the rifle beside me. Nothing happened. The woods stayed quiet. The next day, I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the boot print was old. Maybe it wasn't from that night. Still, I didn't feel relaxed anymore. I felt watched. I started noticing small things. A broken twig near the outhouse that hadn't been broken before. A small piece of red fabric snagged on a tree branch. Could have been from an old hunter's jacket, but it looked fresh. On the fifth night, it got worse. I was half asleep when I heard the sound again. This time it was louder. More footsteps. Slow, steady. Someone was walking in the clearing. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the rifle. I crawled to the window and peeked out, but it was too dark. I couldn't see anything. Then I heard a thud. Something hit the side of the cabin. Just once. Then silence. I stayed still for over an hour. My legs cramped up, my hand tight around the rifle. I never heard footsteps leaving. Just that one thud. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin again. There was a smear of something dark on the wall. Mud? Maybe. It looked like someone had wiped a hand along it. I checked the boot print area again. There were more now. Fainter. Like someone walking slowly through the grass behind the cabin.
No tire marks.
No sign of a vehicle. That's when I made the decision to leave. I started packing right then. It was early, maybe 8 a.m. I loaded my gear into the truck, checked everything twice. I was almost ready when I realized I hadn't filled the gas tank before coming out. I still had a little under a quarter tank, but I didn't know how far the next gas station would be. I didn't want to take chances, so I grabbed the extra fuel can from the back and started pouring it in. That's when I heard it again. A crunch. Close. I turned fast, fuel still pouring into the tank, and saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A man. He was standing just beyond the tree line, maybe 20 yards away, wearing a dark coat, beard, stocky, just watching me. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stared. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do. I dropped the fuel can and reached for the rifle in the passenger seat. When I looked back up, he was gone. No sound, no movement, just trees again. I didn't wait. I slammed the can into the truck bed, jumped in, and drove out as fast as I could without flipping the truck. I bounced down the muddy road, branches whipping against the windows. My hands were shaking. I kept checking the mirrors but saw nothing. It took almost an hour to get back to the main road. Once I did, I drove north without stopping for anything. I didn't even look back. I found a gas station a few towns over, filled up, and parked for a while to calm down. My clothes were soaked with sweat. I didn't tell anyone. Not the police. Not the owner of the cabin. Not anyone. What would I say? I didn't see him again. I never went back. I deleted the emails, threw out the rifle, and sold the truck a few months later. I still think about it all the time. That boot print, the thud, the man in the woods. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know how long he'd been out there, watching, waiting. Maybe he just liked scaring people. Or maybe he was planning something worse. All I know is I trusted that place to be empty. But it wasn't, and I'll never go into the woods alone again.